As members of society, it is our responsibility to protect the most vulnerable among us. Children, the elderly, and people with disabilities are particularly defenseless and require extra care and attention. Unfortunately, instances of abuse and neglect toward these groups are far too common. The abuse and the neglect of children is undoubtedly one of the most difficult issues to address, especially because children are often at the mercy of their own caretakers, who make all of the decisions for them. Children don't have a say in what they eat, what they wear, or who are in their lives. The thought of a helpless child being neglected is heartbreaking enough, but the situation becomes even more disturbing when you consider a child who is bedridden and unable to move or speak. And that was the case for a 3-year-old boy in Polk County, Florida, whose so-called parents called 911 after discovering him unresponsive in his bed on May 12, 2023. When first responders arrived, they were confronted with a sight so horrific that it will undoubtedly remain etched in their memories as one of the most disturbing scenes and experiences of their entire careers. I understand that cases like this are difficult to hear, and they're just as hard to research and discuss, trust me. Regardless, as I have reiterated in the past, if a victim, particularly a child, has to endure something so horrible, then the least that we can do as adults is listen to their story, prevent their experience from being swept under the rug, and hold those responsible accountable. So I want to give a warning that the details of this case are very disturbing, and this video is most likely going to be a difficult one for you to hear. There is no way to get around some of the graphic details when telling this child's story, but again, it's one that needs to be heard. Hey guys, my name is Elise, this is 10 to Life, and let's jump right in. Hi guys, okay, so I just got out of the shower, but I wanted to talk to you again about my sleep, and here's why. I was on vacation last week and I forgot my sleep tea at home, and I wear an Oura ring which tracks your sleep. Now, look at my sleep score. This is out of 100. This was my sleep score one of the nights while I was on vacation when I did not have my tea. Now, at the end of this video, I'm gonna show you what my sleep score was last night after getting back home, getting back into my routine, and most importantly, drinking my sleep tea. But before I spill the beans on my score, let me just remind you guys what this tea is all about and why I am so obsessed with it. United and it feels so good. Okay, I can't sing. But this is the Beam Dream Sleep Tea. I get the sea salt caramel. Is it caramel or caramel? I don't know. I get the sea salt caramel because it tastes just like hot chocolate. Like legit, just like hot chocolate. Now all you do, one scoopy scoop, and then you heat your water and you are good to go. They have 6 amazing flavors, including my favorite, of course, sea salt caramel, cinnamon, cocoa, chocolate, peanut butter, white chocolate peppermint, chocolate raspberry, and get this, mint chip, which is launching on July 24th. Now, last time we talked, I was telling you how Beam is such an amazing partner that they were giving you guys 30% off, but get this, they are now upping that offer and giving you guys 40% off, plus 20% off all future orders, and a free frother when you place your first order. Now guys, I don't know what more I can do to convince you to try this besides showing you my sleep score, bathing in it. You just gotta trust me on this. But speaking of, let me show you that sleep score from when I got back into town last night and drank my tea. Boom, boom. If you remember, we started at a 28. Now I'm in the high 90s. That is because I had my sleep tea. That is proof, that is science, and I'm just telling you, again, it works. It works, it works, it works. Just trust me on this. So I'll put the link in the description for you. You can also use my code 10 to Life. And guys, start sleeping better. 3-year-old KeShaun Allen had done the same thing every day, every single day for years.
he laid lifeless in a hospital bed in his mother's apartment. A ventilator, constantly inflating and deflating, was the only way that he could breathe, and a tube in his stomach was the only way that he could eat. His heartbeat and his skin was warm, but his eyes stayed closed, and he couldn't react to any stimuli like light or even severe pain. By medical standards, KeShaun was brain dead and would never come out of the permanent coma that he was in. However, KeShaun's parents weren't willing to accept that their child would never recover. And for a while, they held on to hope that he would be one of those rare miracle cases, the ones that you hear about in the news. KeShaun's life wasn't always like this, though. So what happened in 3 short years for things to end up this way? To make sense of what happened to this little boy, we need to go back to the beginning. 25-year-old Ephraim Zimbalist Allen Jr. and 24-year-old Takesha Lachelle Williams started dating in 2018 while they were both living in the city of Barstow, located in Polk County, Florida. Polk County is located in central Florida and is the fastest growing county in the state and one of the fastest growing in the country, as a matter of fact. It's less than half an hour away from Walt Disney World in Orlando, and it's also home to the popular Legoland Resort. There hasn't been really any background information published about Ephraim, who goes by Junior, or Takesha, who goes by Keisha. So the only information that I was able to gather from them was primarily from their social media accounts and some public records. Based on posts made over the years by Keisha and Junior, it seems that the two of them had a pretty tumultuous relationship with one another, and also kind of like the relationship was a bit on and off. However, on September 9th, 2019, they welcomed their first child together, a son who they named KeShaun. KeShaun had heart-melting, big brown eyes, a head full of curly black hair, and his little chubby cheeks were just like the perfect complement to his adorable smile. He was born with no issues. He hit all of his milestones, and his life was full of promise and full of potential. However, all of that changed when tragedy struck in July of 2020. The family was staying in a short-term vacation rental in the nearby city of Davenport when 10-month-old KeShaun wandered off and fell into a swimming pool. A baby or toddler who has fallen in water may not be able to control their head enough to lift it up out of the water, depending on their age, and they may not even know how to keep their head up and above water when submerged either. A child will involuntarily take a breath, drawing water directly into their airway. They'll struggle while attempting to breathe and will either cough or swallow water, which then causes throat spasms, sealing off the path to the lungs. With the airway closed, water tunnels directly to the stomach. The throat then relaxes, the child becomes unconscious, and the water fills their lungs. First responders arrived at the pool area of the vacation rental and took over attempting life-saving measures on KeShaun. Devastatingly, by the time he was rushed to the hospital, KeShaun had no brain activity and was unable to even blink his eyes. Based on the severity of the situation, it's clear that he must have been in water for a minimum of 5 minutes. While it's known that drowning can begin with just seconds of a baby entering the water, brain cells begin to die within 5 minutes of oxygen deprivation. When the brain is deprived of oxygen for that long, if the victim doesn't pass away, they are usually left with significant brain damage, known as anoxic brain injury or ABI. The treatment and recovery for ABI varies from person to person, with the person's age, amount of time that they were submerged, and the duration of unconsciousness all being contributing factors. With victims who are comatose for 6 hours or more, ABI is usually permanent, and it's unlikely that they will survive, let alone recover. However, if by chance recovery is possible, the victim will likely show at least some improvement within the first month after the incident, and significant improvement within 6 months. In some cases of severe ABI, a victim may transition from a coma to a persistent vegetative state of sorts, where the brain functions maintain breathing, blood pressure, and heartbeat, but there is no evidence of consciousness. After that, they may transition to a minimally conscious state, a confusional state, and then regain consciousness, but this is very, very rare for somebody with ABI. For little KeShaun, his prognosis was the worst case scenario, other than immediate death, of course. He never transitioned to even a vegetative state, and he remained in a coma permanently after the incident. He experienced what doctors refer to as brain death. A person who suffers brain death would have no chance of recovery because their body is unable to survive without artificial life support. KeShaun was being kept alive with a feeding tube and a ventilator, a machine that basically breathes for you by moving air in and out of your lungs. As hard as it is, when a patient is deemed by doctors to be brain dead, most families have to make the decision to pull their loved one from the life support machine and to allow them to pass away. Some families, especially parents who are faced with losing their child, may prolong the decision until they feel ready to say goodbye. And there are, of course, some families who choose to hold on to hope for a miracle, and there have been extremely rare cases when a person has come out of a coma or a vegetative state and has been able to recover. However, this isn't at all possible if someone has experienced a true brain death. When to let somebody in this situation go has been a moral debate for decades, with some people believing that not giving a person the right to die is cruel and prolonging suffering. In reality, a person who is in a coma, and definitely a person who has had a brain death, does not experience pain, consciousness, awareness, or anything at all. If their body is being kept alive by life support, that's really all it is, their body. Families who can see their loved one's chest moving, feel warmth on their skin, and their heart beating may lose sight of the reality of the situation. And that's exactly what happened with KeShaun's parents. Keisha and Junior were told by his doctors that there was no chance for their son to come out of a coma, and they recommended that they remove him from life support. Despite their recommendations, Keisha and Junior weren't ready to accept that their son was gone, so they decided to take KeShaun home. The only thing that the doctors could do was send them home with instructions on how to care for their son's feeding tube and the trach tube connected to a ventilator. A person who is discharged from the hospital in a vegetative state will typically live for an additional 2 to 5 years. Leaving the hospital in a coma has an even shorter expectancy. However, by 2023, KeShaun had been existing in this state for nearly 3 years. A 10-month-old experiencing a near-fatal, or what some might consider a fatal drowning, is an incident that raises some red flags in itself. How does a 10-month-old not only wander off outside by themselves, but then fall into a pool and remain there long enough to experience such a severe brain injury? Some would argue that this is a clear sign of neglect, but it's actually far more common than you would think, especially in Florida. Florida loses more children under the age of 5 to unintentional drownings more than any other state. In the country, more children ages 1 to 4 die from drowning than any other cause of death. And on average, 4,000 people die every year from drowning. That's nearly 11 deaths every single day. In Florida, it seems like every neighbor has a pool. Every subdivision has a pool. There's ponds, the oceans, and the possibility of drowning around every corner, literally. The presence of an adult isn't the same as supervision, and even momentarily, distractions can lead to horrible consequences. There weren't too many details about what took place the day that KeShaun fell in the pool, but he wasn't the first, and definitely won't be the last little boy for that to happen to. Now, as a side note, I do want to say, if you have a pool, there are some things that you can do to minimize chances with your own kids or your loved ones. Make sure that there's a pool gate, alarms on the doors. There's a water alarm out there now. Make sure that there's water alarms out there now. Make sure there's a dedicated non-distraction water watcher person type thing during swimming time. And teach your kids to flip over on their backs immediately for air. Now, I had to get that out there because my previous house had a pool. It scared me to death with my kids, so I just wanted to do a PSA, but let's get back into our case. Keisha and Junior, who had no prior medical experience, were immediately thrust into this incredibly taxing and emotional life of full-time caregiving. I mentioned before that their relationship already had its ups and downs, and this horrible and unexpected event had taken a toll on both of them. There were times when Keisha and Junior lived apart, and Keisha and KeShaun would live with her sister Frida. Now, Frida loved KeShaun as her own, and after her and Keisha's mother passed away in 2016, she took over looking out for her sister and helping her however she could. She was definitely involved in KeShaun's life, and was a very proud aunt of all of her nieces and her nephews that had been born from her other siblings. Now, Junior had a few run-ins with the law in the past. Once for possession of marijuana, and once for possession of cocaine, as recent as 2019, which was soon before KeShaun was born. It seems like the responsibility of their child kept Junior out of trouble for the most part, at least in the last couple of years. I'm not sure what he exactly did for work, But eventually, after settling into their new normal, Keisha was able to start getting paid to be KeShaun's caregiver. Most states do have some sort of program like this, where if a parent is unable to work because of their child's disability, or if someone becomes the primary caregiver for an elderly family member, the state will pay them for this role. It's obviously not something that's going to make you rich by any means, but that, along with free services from Medicaid, meant that Keisha and Junior didn't have to worry financially about KeShaun's care. They also got free assistance from a home health care provider who would come 3 times a week to help care for KeShaun's feeding tube, ventilator, and trach, and making sure that he was cleaned up and not getting any bed sores from remaining in one position for too long. Keisha was also able to earn some extra money by doing hair out of their home. So over the course of the 3-year period, Keisha and Junior added 2 other little boys to the picture. In February of 2021, they had a son named Amir, and in the summer of 2022, they had another little boy as well. The family was living in Section 8 housing in an apartment complex called Azalea Gardens, and things were going about as well as you could expect. The home healthcare nurse consistently visited and helped with KeShaun 3 times a week. And they at least made sure that he was clean and that his medical needs were taken care of. Taking care of a trach isn't the easiest thing to do, and it's not something that you can just forget about or not keep up with. It has to be cleaned regularly to prevent the buildup of dried mucus. The skin around the opening of the throat and the neck should also be cleaned. There's a lot of things that have to go into this, and it should be cleaned around 2 to 3 times a day to remove the dried mucus and to avoid excess moisture, which can cause a rash. The process is similar for a stomach feeding tube, with the stoma site needing to be cleaned at least twice a day, kept dry to prevent rashes and infections, and flushing the tube after each feeding. It's a lot of work. You can imagine how stressful this could potentially get with 2 other kids under the age of 3 running around the house. So having the home health nurse was not only helpful, but essential. This routine continued until October of 2022, when Keisha and Junior decided that they were going to switch home healthcare companies. On the morning of May 12th, 2023, Keisha woke up to find that KeShaun's pulse oximeter, which is used to measure a person's blood oxygen levels, was malfunctioning. She also noticed that his stomach appeared to be bloated and he felt cold to the touch. Keisha called Junior, who wasn't living in the apartment at the time, and he came over to see what was going on. For whatever reason, it wasn't until a few hours later, at 3 p.m., that they decided to call 911. Keisha told the dispatcher this: "This is really not an emergency. You don't need red lights and sirens, but we'd like fire to come over and check the baby." Her nonchalant tone and the fact that she explicitly said it wasn't an emergency caused paramedics to be completely unprepared for what they were going to see when they walked into that home. I mentioned before that the details of this case are extremely graphic, but I want to give you another warning because I'm about to get into what happened after emergency personnel arrived. When paramedics arrived, they saw a child hooked up to a ventilator, which seemed to be functioning properly, but the child was lifeless. They noticed that the skin on the baby's stomach appeared to be green, and after they determined that he had no pulse, he was immediately transported to a nearby hospital. Medical personnel worked to revive KeShaun for about an hour before they finally pronounced him as dead. They then began the process of trying to figure out what happened, and the more layers of clothing that they took off of KeShaun's little body, the more disturbing the situation became. I'm going to try to stick to what the affidavit and the sheriff on the case has said, because the details are very important here. When they took off KeShaun's diaper, they could see extensive injuries and trauma, which included wounds down into the muscle and large avulsions on his butt to where the rectum was non-existent. This was so severe that his colon, intestines, and spinal cord were visible. It was described as a gaping hole where his rectum should have been. There were several abrasions located on his back, which were consistent with stage 5 bed sores and ulcers. The baby smelled of decomposition, but rigor mortis was not present. This means that he hadn't been dead for very long, or else his body would have been stiff. His stomach was bloated and appeared to have marbling and was green in color, which you'd expect to see on a decomposing body. The open sores and wounds were so severe that they resulted in permanent disfigurement. Doctors advised that the open sores were consistent with maltreatment of a child, It was also discovered that KeShaun had sepsis and bilateral pneumonia. After the examination, the hospital called the Bartow Police Department and told them that they needed to come to the hospital because this was going to be a very complex situation. The police quickly realized that they had never experienced or dealt with such an extreme case of child mistreatment, and they decided to call the Polk County Sheriff's Office for help. When detectives arrived at the hospital, they noted the smell of decomposition as well, which isn't something that you'd normally expect from a person who had just passed away. They went back to the family's home to investigate the living conditions, see what was going on with that situation, and they noted that the home smelled of decomposition as well. They brought Keisha and Junior in and separated them for questioning to figure out what on earth had gone on inside that apartment. They both said that they had tried to get another home health care company set up, but that they weren't able to get anyone to come. However, Keisha and Junior's story quickly unraveled when investigators went to have a discussion with the home healthcare company. The company stated that they had accepted the family into their program, but that when the nurses went to make an introduction and see KeShaun, Keisha and Junior would always have an excuse about why it wasn't a good time. They would say things like, "Don't wake the baby up today," and that they could see the baby next time. But eventually, they stopped answering the door and never seemed to be home. This right here doesn't make a lot of sense when you consider that there was no way for KeShaun to wake up. He was in a permanent coma, so why wouldn't they have just let the nurses take a look at him? You're not going to wake the baby up. Keisha and Junior told investigators that KeShaun started getting open sores about a month prior, but that they didn't call anybody for help because they were afraid that CPS would take away their other two children. They even said, and I quote, "We knew people would assume it was neglect, but he's not neglected." They both admitted that they should have called for help sooner, but based on the autopsy and visual evidence, KeShaun wasn't left to deteriorate for only a month prior. It was the professional's opinion that he hadn't received the proper care since the family ended their relationship with the first home health care company, which was back in October. So for 7 to 8 months, that poor child was not receiving the care that he needed. There have been cases when caregivers experience what is called burnout, or when parents become overwhelmed by the amount of care that their child needs. This typically happens if the caregiver has little to no help or if they have a hard time getting services for their loved ones. However, that wasn't the case with KeShaun. They were offered home health care assistance for free. Not only that, but Keisha was getting paid to take care of KeShaun. It wasn't just her moral obligation as his mother and as a caregiver, it was her literal job. Investigators easily arrived at the conclusion that KeShaun had been severely neglected, and there was no excuse for not getting him help far before the situation turned this extreme. Keisha and Junior were both arrested and charged with child neglect with great bodily harm, but on May 26th, the court upgraded the charges to aggravated manslaughter of a child. The sheriff of Polk County, Florida's name is Grady Judd, and he is actually a pretty famous sheriff across social media. Sheriff Judd has worked for the Polk County Sheriff's Office since 1972 and has served in law enforcement for over 50 years. He's known for his tell-it-like-it-is demeanor, and he is definitely one of the most beloved and respected sheriffs in the state of Florida, and recognizable throughout the nation for his press conferences. I don't want to make light of this situation at all, but hearing some of Sheriff Judd's quotes is a nice relief from such a heavy and tragic story, and you can see why people like watching his press conferences. Here is a best of Grady Judd video from a few local news stations in Florida.
Welcome to Florida on vacation. You're going to leave on probation. Ladies and gentlemen, words matter. Chill out. I can tell you Helen Keller could have seen all the evidence they left in the scene. Huh, guys? It really is a small world after all. This ain't California. It was evident this morning he might have had 5 brain cells. 3 of them weren't working.
Were your 3 brain cells an overload?
But I want to talk to you today about a turkey that's a bad turkey. I think he's thinking, I don't want to go back to prison. But we're thinking you should. Sometimes you think you're passing gas and you're not. You can't trust a fart when you're over 60. Just chill out. Drink a 7-Up, eat a moon pie, quit murdering people. This is not only a bad turkey, he's a bad man. The southern gentleman who's now a battery suspect who is. Some people are slow learners. This is peaceful protest. This is violence.
Craziest thing I've seen.
We arrested you on your birthday. Just consider it our present to you. Gag me with a spoon. Drop it like it's hot. Come on, man. What are you doing? What is wrong with you? Are you kidding me? Well, it warms my heart that she's in jail. You know, you can't make this stuff up. People tell us this is low-level, nonviolent crime.
However, when Sheriff Judd spoke about Keisha and Junior, it was much different from his normal lighthearted press conferences. He didn't leave out any details, and he described what happened to KeShaun as the most disturbing event that he had ever witnessed in his 50-year career. He said, and I quote, "I've seen some truly horrific events, but I have never, ever seen anything as sad, as bone-chilling, and as sickening as what this baby suffered before finally perishing from the despicable acts of these two criminals." According to him, all of the officers, investigators, first responders, and medical personnel were absolutely traumatized by the sight of what KeShaun had lived through, and said that it is something that will never leave them. He basically summed up the situation as the parents leaving the baby to rot in the bed. The press conference was streamed by Fox 35 Orlando.
They let this baby rot and die in its bed. I've done this for 5 decades. I have seen thousands of children abused, hundreds of children murdered at the hands of parents. I have never seen the horror that we saw with this poor child at the hands of these two folks. I talked to all the detectives in the room. Have you ever seen anything like this in your life? No one has. You can't even imagine how horrible the wounds, the ulcers that this child endured at the hands of these folks. They're charged with aggravated manslaughter, among other charges, at this time. They were locked up in the county jail with a bond of $100,000. The state attorney's office actually filed direct once we got the initial medical examiner's report. The state attorney's office, Brian Haas, our state attorney, who is simply the very best, is game on every day, and I'm certain if you talk to him, he would be as mortified as we all are that this baby was left in this condition. My job is to protect children, to protect everyone, but my heart is with protecting the very youngest, because you see, they have no choice of where they live, or what they eat, or what they wear, or who they associate with. It's up to parents to make the right decisions. And I suggest to you the right decisions haven't been made since this child was 10 months old and suffered a horrible, horrible, horrible tragedy. And then I suggest to you, and this is only supposition on my part, they just got tired of the baby. And as a result, the child laid there and suffered and suffered and suffered till finally there was no life left in the baby. The pictures were horrific. It was even more horrific for my detectives and supervisors who were there and had the horrible stench to go along with it. It is just, there's no words to explain it. And I've seen some really bad stuff in my career. I have never seen anything like this.
So how does something like this happen? What would be the reason that Keisha and Junior would deny free home health care and not let anyone come to care for their child? Some believe that after they ended their relationship with the first company, it didn't take long for things to get out of hand, and then they were too afraid to let anyone see the state that he was in. It's possible that they tried to tend to some of his wounds before letting in any professionals, but it could have gotten out of their control and just spiraled downhill from there. However, there is literally no excuse for not getting help at the first sign of an infection, bedsore, or rash, especially with a child whose life is so fragile already. On that note, Keisha and Junior have been heavily criticized for making the choice to take KeShaun home instead of just letting him pass away after the initial drowning incident. I know many families, especially parents, cling on to the possibility of a miraculous recovery, but the doctors made it very clear that he was fully brain dead. It just seems like they couldn't accept the outcome, but others, including Sheriff Judd, believe that they didn't want to let him go because they knew that they could make money if he was alive. They believe that Keisha knew her family would get priority housing and that she would get paid for staying at home and being a caregiver, but after a while, they just got tired of the work involved with taking care of KeShaun. That was discussed in the press conference that Fox 35 Orlando streamed. Keisha's sister made a post on Facebook, and this post said she did her best to take care of her son. If they ever went anywhere outside of the house, you better know her kids were with them. All 3. Stop saying y'all would have let him go, because if y'all were in the situation, you don't know what you would have done. I don't even know what I would have done in that situation. My little sister is strong. We lost our mama, her son had a terrible accident, he passed away, and she went to jail without even properly grieving. She's being wrongly accused for trying her best to take care of her kids. They have 2 beautiful boys out here that need her and their daddy. If you all know Keisha and Junior, you all know them children are their world, literally. And you all know the white are gonna lie and make this sound so terrible. That's why, by the grace of God, they're gonna beat this crap. This is my first and last time speaking on this because I really don't have to explain. But y'all are on here reaching and lying. Y'all don't know my sister. She didn't even have friends. Y'all are weird, lying, and looking for attention. All I gotta say is my sister loves her boys. I hear the pain in her voice every day. Y'all could never go through what she's been through and it has been going through. That is basically the sentiment of all of Keisha and Junior's family, who believe that they should be let out of jail because they tried their best. The direct quote from them. But as you can imagine, social media isn't accepting that these parents tried their best and that there is no excuse for letting KeShaun deteriorate the way he did. It requires active negligence for someone to get stage 5 bed sores. At stage 3, bed sores are already making their way to the fatty tissue layer, starting to smell and may even turn black from the tissue dying around the sore. Sores at this stage already need professional medical care. Stage 4 are much more serious, affecting the muscles and ligaments, and often even require surgery. The stages usually stop at stage 4, with stage 5 being referred to as unstageable because they are so severe that it's not even considered a wound anymore. It's just a hole, for a lack of a better term. These types of severe sores do not happen overnight, or in a few weeks, or even in a month. These are the result of months and months of neglect, not moving someone who is bedbound to different positions, and not cleaning the person properly. Can you imagine how awful it must have been for someone who was supposed to be cleaned 2 to 3 times a day at their sites to just not be cleaned? For everything to just fester and get so bad that the baby went septic? You have to ask yourself, how does a diaper rash or bed sore or pressure ulcers get so bad that the lower anatomy just turns into one huge hole? If you have kids, you probably know how fast a baby can get a diaper rash. It happens pretty quickly. You've probably even dealt with at least one case of severe diaper rash, and where it's just red on the skin and it goes away maybe in a day with some Desitin, maybe 2. The longer a baby sits though in a soiled diaper, the worse a rash gets. Now, I did some reading about feeding tubes, and children fed this way often don't have solid bowel movements. So I can imagine that if a child has these types of bowel movements often and doesn't have any control over their bodily function and isn't tended to constantly, that a sore could arise and just get worse and worse and worse. It is so awful to even think about. Now, some people have noted the fact that KeShaun couldn't move, talk, or even blink, and that it would make it easy for them to ignore the significance of his condition, because technically he wasn't aware of what was going on and wasn't in any pain. If there is any bright side to this horrific, vile situation, it would be that he couldn't feel anything. However, just because someone can't feel what is happening to them doesn't mean it somehow isn't as bad. A person in any state of consciousness still deserves dignity and respect. When things started to get out of control, Keisha and Junior could have brought him back to the hospital and said, look, this is too much for us. They could have made the compassionate decision to allow him to pass peacefully after his initial incident. But even if they weren't able to make that decision until later, it would have still been better than letting him literally decompose from the inside out. Also, if they were in fact hoping for a miracle and hoping that one day KeShaun would magically wake up, how did they expect him to live with such intense and permanent disfigurement? You'd think that if they really wanted him to someday regain consciousness, that they try to keep his body in as good a shape as possible. However, it's thought that they didn't really think he would ever recover, or even want him to, and that they just kept his body alive so that they could continue to collect a monthly paycheck. There is also the question of how did nobody notice that this was going on? How many people knew this was happening and didn't make a call to CPS or a hospital or even the police? There are people online who believe that Keisha and Junior's siblings, especially Keisha's sister Frida, who she lived with at times, should be held responsible for not reporting what was going on. There is no way that nobody in their family knew what was going on or how dire the situation had become. Not to mention, Keisha had people in and out of her home to do their hair. How did nobody notice the smell? How many people were complicit in the blatant ignoring of this little boy and his needs? It's one thing to kind of turn the other cheek and try to mind your own business when it comes to someone's personal life and someone's family. But family members are hardcore defending Keisha and Junior on social media, saying they loved their children and tried their best. Which I'm sorry, but it doesn't take much effort to make a simple phone call for help, especially when that help is free. So I'm not sure in what world this would be considered trying their best. Not having your child seen by any professionals for 7 months isn't trying your best. There are some people even calling into question what level of responsibility do home healthcare companies have in ensuring the wellness of their patients. Since the new company never actually cared for or even met KeShaun, would they have been responsible for reporting that his parents were not accepting the help or letting them see him? In some of the posts about this case, people have argued that a home healthcare company can't force their way in and can't do anything if parents aren't allowing them to see the patient. However, you'd think that after months or even just 1 month of no response from the family, that the company would at least demand to put eyes on the child, or maybe even report the situation to CPS for a wellness check or something. I've said it in other cases about child welfare. If the state is giving money to a family for the care of a child, whether it be food stamps or medical services, the state should at the bare minimum make sure that the child is alive. If this were an adult and there had been a home healthcare company assigned to take care of an elderly person, but then all of the sudden the person's child says they can't see the patient anymore and then stops answering the door, don't you think it would be the company's responsibility to report that? At the end of the day, what happened to KeShaun is Junior and Keisha's responsibility. But I still think that if someone had intervened, this situation could have possibly been different. I believe that even though KeShaun had the right to pass away after the drowning incident, he should have eventually been allowed to do so with dignity and while being lovingly cared for. I know the details about this case were incredibly hard to hear, but I want to know what you think about this case. Do you think that the charges of aggravated manslaughter are appropriate? To be honest, I don't think that when KeShaun had his original incident that it was his parents' intention to keep him alive for nefarious reasons. At least I would hope not. I can't see a parent wanting to keep their child's body alive for the sole purpose of getting a monthly check, especially considering how much work and stress full-time caregiving comes with. I think that even after the birth of their second child, managing his care with the help of a nurse was difficult, but manageable. But by the time their third child was born, I think maybe it became too overwhelming. I just can't wrap my mind around why they started denying free assistance and then let the situation get so deplorable. The 2 other babies, who at the time of the arrest were 2 years old and 10 months old, were said to be well taken care of and in good health. But I can't imagine the things that they saw in that home with their older brother. They have since been taken into protective custody. Family members made posts in the past about getting in bed with KeShaun and loving on him, which is really sweet until you consider the condition that he was in. How long does the smell of infection and decomposition have to linger before your nose becomes immune to it? I just can't fathom that no one else knew about this, and I think other family members should be at least called in for questioning as well and answer for their level of responsibility or complicity. I think that this case raises the issue about the morality of keeping someone who is medically brain dead alive, but based on people's different spiritual and moral beliefs, that is such a nuanced gray area to navigate. It would be difficult, and in most cases unfair, to demand that a family pull life support from a loved one, but it also could prevent tragic situations like this from occurring. I hope at the very least that this case can shine a light on the fact that children, especially vulnerable or disabled children, should be checked on or have mandatory appointments to assess their well-being, especially if the parent is getting government assistance. There is no way that a child should be able to just fly under the radar like this, and the people whose job it was to care for KeShaun should be held responsible, in my opinion. Sheriff Grady Judd said that it's the state's intention to seek the maximum prison sentence, but reiterated that no amount of prison can make up for the torture that this child endured. Keisha and Junior are each being held on a $100,000 bond. I will definitely be looking for updates on this case, and as devastating as what happened to KeShaun was, there is solace in knowing that he can finally rest in peace. All right, guys, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. Please don't forget to show your support for the channel by hitting that like button, doing all of the YouTube things, hitting subscribe if you haven't, so that you don't miss future cases. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. Did they keep him alive for a paycheck, or did this just escalate and get out of control very quickly? All right, guys, thanks again, and until the next one, stay safe.